So, you entered into a marriage with your own brother to perpetrate immigration fraud, siphoned money from your boyfriend via your campaign, and referred to 9/11 as merely some people doing something? Yet you believe you have the standing to lecture me on American values? What transpired next was not simply a debate, nor was it merely a destruction. It was a public autopsy of a political career that arguably should never have existed in the first place. Ilhan Omar strode into that Fox News town hall in Minneapolis, her own district and backyard, believing she was protected and thinking her identity would shield her from scrutiny. She assumed Trump would not dare to bring up the evidence that had been accumulating for years like snow before an avalanche, but she was profoundly mistaken. By the time 75 minutes had elapsed, even her staunchest backers were exiting the venue. The squad was frantically scrubbing tweets. Democratic leadership was already preparing statements to dissociate themselves, and the woman who had cloaked herself in progressive talking points while allegedly breaking federal laws was finally and irrevocably exposed. If you have been waiting years to witness Ilhan Omar answer for her actions against America, this is your moment. Drop a flag emoji in the comments section if you are prepared to see justice delivered alongside brutal honesty, because what Donald Trump achieved that night will be examined in political science courses as a masterclass in dismantling an opponent using solely facts. The Fox News special town hall had been billed as a confrontation with the squad, but everyone understood it was truly centered on one individual. Brett Baier stood on the stage at the Minneapolis Convention Center, embodying the serious journalist attempting to maintain order over what promised to be a tumultuous evening. The audience of 300 was divided 60-40, with Republicans and independents on the right, and progressives alongside Omar's supporters on the left. However, seated in the very front row, distinct from both factions, were 12 individuals wearing photographs pinned to their chests. These were photographs of loved ones who would never attend another town hall, people who perished on September 11, 2001. The 9/11 families had traveled to Minneapolis specifically for this event. Trump entered first, executing his signature double-point gesture toward the crowd, causing the right side of the room to erupt. He wore a navy suit with a red tie, his American flag pin gleaming under the studio lights, and he settled into his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times and won almost all of them. Then came Omar, wearing a burgundy hijab paired with a black blazer, projecting the image of a serious congresswoman prepared for a serious debate. Her supporters cheered while someone shouted out their love for her, prompting her to smile that camera-ready smile as she took her seat. Brett Baier cleared his throat to welcome everyone to the Fox News special town hall, stating they would address critical issues facing the nation with President Trump and Representative Ilhan Omar. He attempted to begin with the first audience question, but Trump leaned forward and asked if he could say something first. Brett sighed quietly, but agreed, allowing the president to speak. Trump thanked Fox for organizing the event and thanked Ilhan for being there, acknowledging that Minneapolis was her home and her district. He noted that it took courage to come there to face him, to answer questions, and to defend her record, adding that he genuinely respected that. He paused, and the smile that spread across his face resembled that of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. He declared that by the end of the night, everyone in the room and everyone watching at home would know exactly who she was and what she had done. He warned that she wouldn't be able to hide behind claims of Islamophobia, racism, or any other shields she typically used. It would be just facts, just evidence, and just the truth. Omar's smile faltered for a split second as Trump thanked her for being there, remarking that it was going to be very educational for everyone. Brett Baier looked like a man who already regretted every decision that led him to this moment. having no idea it was about to get significantly worse. The first question came from a middle-aged Somali-American man in the audience who noted that while Omar spoke about her refugee journey, there were allegations about her immigration story that troubled many in their community. He asked if she could address those troubling allegations directly. Omar straightened in her chair, clearly prepared for this inquiry, and thanked him for the question. She stated that she had been very transparent about her story, coming as a refugee, working hard, becoming a citizen, and living the American dream. She dismissed the conspiracy theories about her family as nothing more than Islamophobic smears designed to distract. Trump immediately interrupted, noting with a smile that not even 5 minutes had passed, and they were already invoking Islamophobia, which might be a record. The audience laughed, and Omar's face flushed as Trump asked if he could call her Ilhan. Trump pulled a folder from under his chair and asked if these were just conspiracy theories, why she wouldn't simply take a DNA test. She retorted that it was an invasion of privacy, but Trump countered that it was a mere cheek swab that takes 5 minutes. He was clearly enjoying this, explaining that the way to end conspiracy theories is with evidence and proof. He challenged her to produce DNA showing Ahmed Elmi isn't her brother, promising that if she did, the issue would be over and he would personally apologize on national television. He paused for her response, but when she didn't answer, he opened his folder to explain why she wouldn't do it. He stated it wasn't a conspiracy theory, but the truth, and he claimed he could prove it. The audience went quiet as Trump walked to the big screen where an image appeared showing a document with British government seals. He pointed out the line listing the father's name as Nur Saeed Elmi, born in Somalia, who fled during the Civil War. He pulled out another document, changing the image to her refugee application from 1995, showing her father's name as Nur Saeed Elmi from Somalia, who also fled during the Civil War. Trump turned to the audience, admitting he wasn't a genius who went to Harvard or Yale, but he knew enough to understand the implications. He argued that when two people have the same father, from the same country, fleeing the same war at the same time, they are family, specifically brothers and sisters, as a matter of basic biology. A woman in Omar's section shouted that it wasn't proof, and Trump agreed that the same father's name could technically be an unusual coincidence. He suggested looking at more evidence, as a marriage certificate appeared on screen from August 2009, showing she married Ahmed Elmi. Trump walked closer to Omar's chair, noting that this is where it gets interesting because at that time she was in a cultural marriage with Ahmed Hirsi. She had been with Hirsi since 2002 and had 2 children with him. He looked at the audience, pointing out the complication of being culturally married to one guy with kids while legally marrying another guy. He joked about modern relationships, prompting some nervous laughter, but then noted the lease agreements that appeared on screen from 2009 to 2011. All 3 of them, Omar, Elmi, and Hirsi, were living at the same address in Columbia Heights, sharing one apartment. He turned to Omar, declaring that it wasn't complicated, but rather weird, unless Elmi wasn't really her husband. Trump let the implication hang there. Unless he is your brother, and you are committing immigration fraud to get him U.S. citizenship. The audience erupted with shouts coming from both sides as Brett tried to restore order. Trump pulled up another image, calling it his favorite piece of evidence from Elmi's Instagram, which had been deleted but recovered because the internet is forever. It was a photo of her daughter, and in the caption, Elmi called her his niece. He looked directly at Omar and asked why her husband would call her daughter his niece, demanding an explanation. Omar's voice was shaking now as she claimed this had all been investigated and debunked. Trump pulled out another document, revealing an internal memo from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services from 2016. It stated there were red flags raised about her marriage and that investigators recommended looking into potential marriage fraud, but it was blocked politically. He explained it was blocked because she was running for office and Democrats didn't want the bad publicity. He waved the paper, declaring that this wasn't debunked. It was covered up, and there is a difference. Trump walked back to center stage to discuss the craziest part of the situation. He reminded everyone that she came here as a refugee, and America took her in when she had nothing, giving her safety, shelter, and opportunity. His voice got quieter and more serious as he asked what she did in return, accusing her of turning around and committing fraud. She abused the very immigration system that saved her life to get her brother citizenship he didn't earn. He looked at the Somali-American man who'd asked the question, stating, "This is why people are angry, not because of where she's from or her religion. She is proof that the system can be abused, proof that we need stronger verification, and living evidence of why border security matters." Trump turned back to Omar, telling her she could call it Islamophobia if she wanted. But Islam doesn't teach people to commit fraud. He asserted that Muslims are honest, hard-working people, and that she was the one disrespecting Islam by using it as a shield for criminal behavior. Several Muslim Americans in the audience nodded, and one woman removed her button that said she stood with Ilhan. Trump continued, saying the thing that really kills him is that years later, after educating her for free on the taxpayer's dime, she calls the country legally racist. He shook his head at the audacity and ingratitude of saying the country that saved and educated her is racist. He sat back down, warning that the immigration fraud was just the beginning, and they should wait to hear what she said about 9/11. He looked directly at the camera, asking viewers to share this if they think immigrants who commit fraud should be deported, even if they are members of Congress. Brett Baier tried to move forward to national security and foreign policy, but Trump stood up to interrupt. He wanted to introduce some very special guests who were there that night, and the camera panned to the front row. The 12 people with photographs pinned to their chests were the faces of the missing and the dead, the 9/11 families. Trump explained quietly that they traveled to Minneapolis because they wanted to hear Ilhan Omar explain something she said that hurt them deeply. Omar's face went pale as she realized what was coming. Trump asked if they should play the clip, and despite Omar saying she wasn't sure, Brett ordered it to be played. The screen filled with footage from March 2019 showing Omar at a CARE fundraiser speaking passionately to a cheering crowd. She stated that CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to civil liberties. Trump paused the video, and the silence in the room was crushing. He repeated the phrase, "Some people did something," softly, noting that this was how she described September 11, 2001. He reminded the audience that it was the worst terrorist attack in American history. The murder of 2,977 innocent Americans. He looked at the audience, remarking that she spoke as if it was a fender bender or someone spilling coffee, something too minor to even name properly. A man in the front row stood up, his voice breaking, and said his wife died in Tower 2. He explained she was 29 years old. They had been married 6 months, and her name was Sarah Mitchell. He stated firmly that she wasn't a something, she was everything. Trump gestured for him to continue, and the man described how she called him from the 103rd floor, saying she loved him and was scared before the line went dead. His voice cracked as he declared that was not something done by some people, that was murder and terrorism. He demanded she say their names and say what they did. An elderly woman stood next to him, barely holding herself together, and spoke of her son, a firefighter named Michael Patterson. She said he ran into those buildings when everyone else ran out and saved 12 people before Tower 1 collapsed on him. She looked directly at Omar and demanded she say his name, insisting it wasn't some people or something, but Michael Patterson. Omar stammered that she didn't mean to minimize it, but Trump cut in to say she did minimize it. He argued it wasn't a one-time mistake but a pattern, pulling up more evidence from 2013 on a Somali language forum. He read her words where she wrote that Americans overreact to 9/11 and that more people die from medical errors every year. She had claimed Americans use the attack as an excuse for imperialism, causing gasps to ripple through the audience. Trump's voice was hard as he told her to tell the families in the room that they overreacted when they lost their loved ones. He pulled up another document, warning that it gets worse with private messages to a progressive activist group leaked in 2020. She wrote that the American obsession with 9/11 is useful politically, and advised that when questioned, one should invoke Islamophobia and post-9/11 discrimination. Trump read the line again slower. Make them feel guilty for their reaction to the attack. He emphasized she didn't mean guilty for discriminating against Muslims, but guilty for reacting to 3,000 Americans being murdered. He walked toward the front row, accusing her of seeing 9/11 as a political opportunity and a weapon to use against grieving families. A third family member stood, a younger man with anger in his voice, saying he was 7 years old when his father died. He said he grew up without him because some people did something, and demanded she admit Islamic terrorists committed mass murder on American soil. Trump turned to Omar and asked if she could say it right now in front of these families. Islamic terrorists committed mass murder on September 11, 2001. He asked her to say they were evil, the victims were innocent, and she grieves for them without reservation. He paused, asking for 5 sentences with no buts and no context about American foreign policy, just basic human decency. Omar opened her mouth and started to say the attacks were terrible, but we also have to acknowledge American foreign policy. Trump turned to the audience, pointing out that even now she cannot condemn terrorism without adding that America deserved it. He pulled out one more document regarding an FBI security clearance review on her in 2019. He read from the internal memo that the subject shows troubling sympathy for anti-American narratives and an inability to condemn terrorism without equivocation. The memo recommended denial of a high-level security clearance because she couldn't be trusted with America's secrets. Trump noted that Democratic leadership overruled the FBI, putting politics over security. He walked to the front row, standing among the 9/11 families, describing how every year on September 11th, they wake up and relive the worst day of their lives. They see the towers fall in their minds, remember the phone calls, and visit graves. His voice got quiet, but fierce, as he accused her of calling it something done by some people, as if their grief doesn't matter. Trump turned to face Omar directly, explaining the difference between them is that when he says something offensive, he owns it and doesn't apologize, but he doesn't hide. He pointed at her, noting she said these things, minimized 9/11, and when caught, she called everyone who questioned her Islamophobic. He gestured to the families, asking if they were Islamophobic or just heartbroken and angry, deserving an apology she'll never give. Trump pulled out one final document to show who agrees with him. Her own imam, Imam Abdul Salam Adam from the Islamic Center of Minneapolis. He read the statement where the imam said he had counseled Representative Omar repeatedly about her rhetoric regarding 9/11 and terrorism. The imam noted her refusal to clearly condemn terrorism and her minimization of the worst attack on American soil shamed their community. Trump folded the paper, emphasizing that her own spiritual leader says she brings shame to Muslims, not Republicans. He walked back to his chair, stating that real Muslim Americans love this country and condemn terrorism. He sat down, asserting that she can't do it because she fundamentally doesn't believe in American values. 3 of the 9/11 family members stood and walked out weeping as the camera followed them, and social media exploded with "Say Their Names" trending worldwide. Trump looked at the camera, declaring that this woman hates America, and urged viewers to wait until they see who has been funding her campaign. Bret Baier, visibly shaken, tried to redirect to Middle East policy. Trump interrupted, saying they would discuss it, but first they needed to talk about why she really hates Israel and who is paying her to do so. Omar sat up straighter, claiming she doesn't hate Israel, but criticizes their government's policies toward Palestinians. Trump finished her sentence, adding that she uses every anti-Semitic trope from the last 2,000 years. He pulled up a tweet on the big screen dated February 2019 with the text, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby." Trump explained that Benjamins means money, and she was saying Jews use money to buy politicians. He told her that is not policy criticism, but an anti-Semitic trope used to justify pogroms and genocide for 2 millennia. Omar started to respond, but Trump kept going as another tweet appeared. This one marked as deleted within 3 hours. It claimed AIPAC owns Congress like property, suggesting Jews own the government. He pulled up another from 2012 stating, "Israel hypnotizes the world," which she deleted after getting elected, but believed when she wrote it. He turned to face her, calling hypnotizes, puppet masters, and secret control literal Nazi propaganda talking points. A Jewish woman in the audience stood up, saying her grandparents survived the Holocaust and heard these same words in Germany before their families were murdered. Trump nodded, agreeing exactly that this isn't political disagreement, but ancient hatred with a progressive filter. He pulled up audio on his phone from a private fundraiser that had been leaked. Omar's voice filled the room, stating that Jewish members of Congress can't be trusted on Middle East policy because they have divided loyalties. Trump stopped the recording to highlight the dual loyalty accusation used against Jews in every country they've lived in. He ticked off on his fingers that this was used in the Dreyfus Affair, in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, and now by a sitting U.S. Congresswoman. An older man wearing a kippah stood in the audience, identifying himself as a lifelong Democrat, and asked her to please stop because these words lead to violence. Omar tried to speak, but Trump wasn't done, stating he didn't get how she tweets that Israel and America commit human rights abuses just like Hamas and the Taliban. He pointed out that she equates democracies with terrorist organizations. He brought up the tweet comparing them, noting Israel has courts and rights for women and gays, whereas Hamas throws gay people off buildings. Trump spread his hands, asking why they are the same to her, and then answered his own question. He said it is because they both oppose radical Islam, which is the only thing they have in common. To her, anyone who opposes radical Islam is evil, whether they are a democracy or a terrorist organization. He pulled up financial records to talk about who is paying her, specifically CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Documents appeared showing federal court evidence from the Holy Land Foundation trial proving CAIR was founded by people with Hamas connections. Trump pointed at the documents showing she raised over $800,000 for them, and they donated $127,000 to her campaigns. More financial records appeared, showing Qatar Foundation board members donated $89,000 to her. He noted that Qatar hosts Hamas leadership and funds terrorism, but their money is good enough for her campaign. He pulled up photos of her meeting with Turkish government representatives, later designated as supporting terrorist organizations. Trump walked to the center, summarizing that she takes money from terrorism supporters and then accuses Jews of buying influence. He called the hypocrisy breathtaking and pulled out a letter from her own party's Jewish members. He read the statement signed by every Jewish Democrat in Congress, saying they have tried for years to educate her about anti-Semitic rhetoric. They wrote that she apologizes publicly and doubles down privately, and the evidence shows it isn't ignorance, it's hatred. Trump looked up, emphasizing that her own party is done with her. He walked toward Omar, his voice dropping to a conversational tone, asking if she knew the most dangerous thing about anti-Semitism. He said it always starts with words like, "Jews control the money," or "Jews have dual loyalty." His voice hardened as he explained that once those ideas take root, bad things happen, reminding her that 6 million people were murdered because of these ideas. He pointed at her, accusing her of spreading them on Twitter like they are just hot takes with no consequences. Trump turned to the audience and asked what would happen if a white Republican congressman tweeted that black people were naturally violent. He answered that they'd be expelled immediately. Yet she tweets anti-Semitic tropes repeatedly and remains on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He argued she stays because she checks the right identity boxes. Omar tried to speak, claiming she criticizes the Israeli government, not Jewish people. Trump said flatly, no, stating she uses ancient tropes, takes money from terrorism supporters, and questions the loyalty of colleagues. He sat down, declaring that isn't criticism, it's bigotry, and she gets away with it because Democrats are afraid to call it what it is. Several people in the Democratic section removed their Omar buttons, and the shift in the room was palpable. Trump looked at the camera, warning that her campaign money situation is even worse. He stated that her boyfriend got very rich off donations from people who trusted her. He asked viewers to share if they think corruption is corruption, no matter who commits it. Trump didn't wait for Brett to speak and introduced the topic of Tim Minot. Omar's entire body tensed as Trump described him as her boyfriend when she started paying him millions, though he is her husband now. Trump smiled, noting that while most people date with dinner and a movie, Ilhan Omar pays them $3.8 million in campaign money. He let that number hang there. $3.8 million. Trump pulled up a photo of Minot, describing him as a 38-year-old marketing consultant with no major clients before Omar. He paused to joke that Minot is very good at one thing, dating his boss. The audience laughed, even some on the left. Trump brought up a timeline showing that in 2018, Omar was married to Ahmed Hirsi, while Minot was married to Dr. Beth Minot. Documents appeared showing Omar's campaign started paying Minot's company, E Street Group, with a first payment of $23,000. By the end of 2018, the total was $230,000. He looked at Omar asking what kind of consulting is worth that much from a first-term congresswoman. More financial records appeared for 2019, showing payments increased to $350,000. Trump then pulled up divorce papers from April 2019 filed by Beth Minot. He read from her sworn deposition where she stated her husband told her he was in love with Ilhan Omar. When asked how he could afford to leave, he allegedly said, "Don't worry, Ilhan's campaign is paying for everything." The audience gasped as Trump continued reading that the relationship became physical during campaign trips billed to donors. Romantic dinners in California and hotel suites in New York were all paid for by people who thought they were funding a political campaign. He looked up, stating they were actually funding an affair. Trump brought up more records showing that after they got married in March 2020, payments to Minot's company increased to $1.1 million in 2020 and $1.3 million in 2021. The total appeared on screen, $3.8 million to her husband's company. Trump put that in perspective, saying it's enough to send 40 kids to college or start 100 small businesses. Instead, it went to her boyfriend's consulting firm. Trump asked what he actually did, pulling out campaign materials showing generic posts any consultant could do for $50,000. He spread his hands asking what made Tim Minot worth $3.8 million, then answered, "Oh, right, he's sleeping with his client." The laughter was loud now. Trump pulled out printed emails from real donors who felt betrayed. One single mother said her $500 donation meant something, and she felt betrayed it was spent on a boyfriend's company. Another donor from Brooklyn said he wanted to support a progressive woman of color, but instead funded an affair. Trump looked at the camera, emphasizing, these are real working people who trusted her. He held up a hand before Omar could object, acknowledging she laundered it through the company so it wasn't direct theft, but it was still betrayal. He brought up evidence that the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board already found her guilty of violations. She had to pay back thousands for personal travel and tax preparation. He pointed out she used donor money to fix fraudulent tax returns from when she was married to her brother. He called it fraud layered on fraud. Omar tried to dismiss them as minor clerical errors, but Trump shot back that $3.8 million isn't a clerical error. He noted the Federal Election Commission is still investigating because federal investigations take time. He sat down, organizing his papers, and reminded her she ran as a progressive fighting corruption. He looked directly at her, accusing her of running her own corruption scheme the whole time. He asked the audience what would happen if he paid his wife's company $3.8 million in campaign funds, joking that CNN would have a countdown clock to his arrest. He pointed out she is still in Congress because she is protected by identity politics. Trump pulled out one more document and asked a simple question about what services donors received for that money. Omar stammered about strategy but couldn't provide specifics. Trump smiled, concluding she had nothing because there was nothing but corruption wrapped in progressive rhetoric. He looked at the camera, suggesting the FBI should investigate because this is crime, not politics. After being systematically destroyed on all fronts, Ilhan Omar played her last card. She claimed the entire evening had been nothing but Islamophobic, racist, and sexist attacks on a Muslim woman of color. Trump actually clapped, saying he was waiting for that identity shield. He stood up to explain the magic trick of how it works to the audience. He counted on his fingers. Present evidence of fraud. Get called Islamophobic. Show 9/11 minimization. Get called racist. Prove corruption. Get called sexist. He explained that everything becomes about her identity, so nothing becomes about her actions. Trump pulled up a montage on the screen showing her responding to criticism over the years with the exact same defense. Whether it was marriage fraud, tweets, or campaign finance, her response was always to attack her critics as bigots. Trump turned to the audience to highlight the pattern. He explained she never defends her actions. She makes you the villain for noticing her crimes. She doesn't explain why Elmi isn't her brother. She calls you racist for asking. He pointed at Omar, calling it a deflection that has worked for years because Democrats are terrified of being called racist. Trump pulled up photos of Muslim Americans who have criticized her, including imams and community leaders. He read their quotes, saying she brings shame to the community and doesn't represent Islam. He asked Omar if these American Muslims who love this country are also Islamophobic. More photos appeared of women and Somali Americans who criticized her. Trump asked if they were all sexist or racist against their own community. He walked back to his chair, stating that when everyone who criticizes you is somehow bigoted, maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe it's you. Trump leaned forward to explain that she relies on identity because she cannot defend the overwhelming evidence of her fraud and corruption. He pointed at her, arguing she turns investigators into bad guys to distract from the truth. He stood up, his voice getting louder, declaring that her identity has nothing to do with it. He walked toward her, saying what people whisper in private. Being Muslim, black, or a woman doesn't give you permission to commit fraud or steal. The audience erupted in applause, the relief of hearing it said out loud palpable. Trump waited for silence before stating that identity doesn't shield you from accountability. He pointed at her, asserting she is subject to the same laws as everyone else. He noted she has used identity as a weapon to silence criticism, but he isn't afraid because he's been called everything already. He sat down, calling her a criminal who happens to be Muslim, not a victim. The standing ovation was deafening. Trump let it die down before starting the final takedown. He stood in the center of the stage, his tone becoming almost philosophical. He told her America gave her everything. She came as a 12-year-old refugee fleeing war with nothing, and this country opened its arms. Trump described how America gave her safety, shelter, food, and a future. He reminded her that taxpayers paid for her education, made her a citizen, and elected her to Congress. He called it proof that America works and is special. The big screen lit up with a timeline showing how she repaid that generosity. It listed every opportunity America gave her paired with her response. Fraud, racism accusations, minimizing 9/11, and stealing funds. Trump gestured at the timeline, saying every step of the way America was generous, and every step of the way she spit in our face. He pulled up quotes where she said she probably loves America less than anyone in Congress. He asked why she is here if she hates the country, then answered that she loves the money, power, and platform. He walked closer, calling her a parasite feeding on America while killing the host. Trump pulled out a list of what she could have done. Been honest, condemned terrorism, shown gratitude. Instead, she committed fraud and divided Americans. He walked back to center stage, shaking his head at her choices. Trump pulled out leaked emails from progressive organizations discussing how Omar is perfect for driving wedges and generating donations. He called her a useful idiot for people who want to destroy the party and for foreign adversaries. He showed data of Russian and Chinese bots amplifying her messages. He sat down, his voice sad, telling the audience that America is special and worth defending. He pointed at Omar, saying she is living proof that America isn't the racist empire she claims. He argued that if America were evil, she'd still be in a refugee camp instead of living in luxury in Congress. Yet she sits there telling everyone the country is evil while stealing from donors. Trump walked toward her slowly, calling her a traitor. He clarified he didn't mean a traitor for criticizing policy, but for systematically working against American interests while living off its generosity. He turned to the audience, calling it textbook betrayal. He walked to the 9/11 families and issued a final challenge. He asked her to say just 8 sentences: that she loves America, is grateful, was wrong to minimize 9/11, wrong to commit fraud, condemns terrorism, and is sorry. Omar started to speak but immediately pivoted to context and imperialism. Trump told the audience that even now she cannot say she loves America without a but. He told her she hates us and always has. Trump addressed the Minneapolis crowd, asking if they still want her representing them after she lied, stole, and embarrassed their city. Several Omar supporters walked out, and others removed their buttons. Trump told Omar she gave them nothing but contempt. He sat down, declaring she doesn't deserve to be in Congress or a citizen because citizenship is a commitment. He gathered his papers, telling Brett he was done. The silence was absolute, as Omar sat frozen, her career in ruins. Trump looked at the camera, urging viewers to demand accountability because America deserves better. The town hall ended, and hashtags about Omar trended worldwide. In the convention center, former supporters chanted for her to resign. Brett Baier remarked he had never seen anything like it. Within 20 minutes, the squad was in crisis mode, deleting tweets. The next day, media coverage was universal, with even allies distancing themselves. Investigations began immediately from the FBI, IRS, and state officials. Omar's approval rating plummeted, and a primary challenger, Don Samuels, launched a viral campaign. Polls showed him up 17 points. International reactions varied, with Israel saying they warned about her and Somalia distancing itself. Surprisingly, Al-Azhar University condemned her actions as bringing shame to Muslims. Omar attempted a disastrous interview on MSNBC where she couldn't answer questions about the DNA test. Her own supporters demanded she take the test. Donations dried up, and legal fees mounted. 1 month later, the House Ethics Committee announced a formal investigation. Nancy Pelosi privately told Omar to resign or face expulsion. Having lost all allies, Omar eventually called a press conference to announce she would not seek re-election. Trump tweeted, "Good," calling it progress. Pulling an Omar became a term for using identity politics to shield corruption. Minneapolis voters turned against her, and local Somali leaders worked to repair their reputation. The refugee who became a congresswoman became a cautionary tale about accountability. She had been given everything and threw it away for fraud and hatred. Ilhan Omar's career ended because Americans finally saw who she really is. Share this story if you believe no one is above the law. The resignation of Ilhan Omar from the United States Congress did not mark the end of the saga, but rather the beginning of a relentless legal and cultural reckoning that would grip the nation for months. While her departure from the political stage removed the immediate shield of congressional privilege, it simultaneously stripped away the hesitation that federal prosecutors often feel when investigating a sitting official. The Department of Justice, now free from the optics of interfering in an active election cycle, unleashed the full weight of its investigative machinery upon the tangled web of finances and immigration documents that had been exposed. Agents from the FBI and the IRS coordinated a synchronized raid on the headquarters of the E Street Group in Washington, D.C., seizing servers, financial ledgers, and years of internal correspondence. The images of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the firm owned by her husband, Tim Minott, played on a loop on cable news, serving as a visceral symbol that the era of impunity had definitively concluded. The sheer volume of evidence recovered from those servers was described by insiders as cataclysmic, revealing a deliberate and systematic architecture of fraud that went far beyond mere clerical errors or sloppy bookkeeping. Investigators uncovered a series of shell companies set up specifically to funnel campaign donations into personal accounts, disguising the transfers as consulting fees for services that were never rendered. Emails surfaced showing direct coordination between Omar and Minott on how to structure these payments to avoid triggering automatic audits, displaying a level of criminal intent that dismantled any remaining defense of ignorance. One particularly damaging email chain featured Minott joking about the retirement fund whenever a new surge of fundraising dollars arrived following one of Omar's controversial tweets. It became clear that her controversial public statements were not just ideological outbursts, but calculated financial triggers designed to milk outrage for personal profit. As the federal indictment loomed, the political alliance known as the Squad began to fracture under the immense pressure of association, with former allies scrambling to save their own careers. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had once famously posed for magazine covers with Omar, quietly scrubbed their shared photos from her Instagram feed and declined multiple requests for comment regarding the investigation. Rashida Tlaib attempted to pivot the conversation back to international policy, but she found herself speaking to empty rooms as donors and constituents grew wary of a brand now toxic with corruption. The Democratic leadership, sensing that the progressive wing was becoming a liability that could cost them the general election, initiated a ruthless internal purge to distance the party from radical elements. Behind closed doors, party whips warned junior members that any defense of Omar's actions would result in the immediate stripping of committee assignments and the drying up of campaign funds. The first wave of indictments hit 3 months after her resignation, charging Ilhan Omar with 18 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit marriage fraud. The indictment detailed a decade-long scheme involving the falsification of federal documents, the misuse of charitable funds, and the willful deception of the United States government regarding her marital history. When Omar appeared at the federal courthouse in Minneapolis for her arraignment, the scene was a stark contrast to the cheering crowds of her early political rallies. There were no adoring fans, no cameras celebrating a barrier-breaking historic figure, only a somber silence broken by the shouts of protesters demanding accountability. She entered a plea of not guilty, but her demeanor was that of a person who understood the walls were closing in. Her eyes scanning the crowd for support that simply was no longer there. The trial itself became a national spectacle, not for the theatrics of the defense, but for the cold, methodical precision of the prosecution's case. Witnesses who had been terrified to speak while she held power now came forward with damning testimony about the culture of intimidation and silence she had enforced within her circle. A former campaign aide testified that staff members were forced to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements and were threatened with blacklisting if they questioned the payments to Minette's firm. Another witness, a member of the Somali community in Minneapolis, broke down on the stand as he described how Omar's team had threatened to deport his family if he revealed what he knew about her marriage to Ahmed Elmi. This testimony shattered the lingering narrative that she was a champion for immigrants, revealing her instead as someone who used the vulnerability of her own people as leverage to protect her secrets. The prosecution then played the trump card that Donald Trump had alluded to during the town hall: the genetic evidence regarding her relationship with Ahmed Elmi. Although Omar had refused a voluntary test, investigators had obtained DNA samples from a licked envelope sent by Elmi and compared it with familial DNA on file from her verified relatives. The forensic expert testified with scientific certainty that the genetic markers indicated a full sibling relationship, scientifically proving that she had married her brother. The courtroom gasped not at the revelation itself, which had been rumored for years, but at the undeniable finality of the science confirming it. This was no longer a conspiracy theory or a right-wing smear. It was a biological fact entered into the permanent legal record of the United States. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to rely on the familiar strategy of claiming the prosecution was politically motivated and driven by bias against her identity. However, the judge, a stern appointee with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom grandstanding, repeatedly sustained objections to these arguments, ruling them irrelevant to the facts of the fraud charges. The jury, composed of a diverse cross-section of Minnesotans, appeared unimpressed by the attempts to deflect, focusing instead on the mountains of financial documents and sworn affidavits. The defense's collapse was total when Tim Minot, facing his own lengthy prison sentence, cut a deal with prosecutors and agreed to testify against his wife. Minot's testimony was devastating as he walked the jury through the timeline of their affair and the specific conversations where they decided to use campaign funds to finance their lifestyle. He admitted that the consulting services were largely fictitious, creating a paper trail for work that never happened to justify the transfer of nearly $4 million. Minot described expensive vacations, luxury hotels, and personal debts paid off with money that working-class donors believed was going to fight for social justice. He revealed that Omar privately mocked her donors, referring to them as gullible for believing her narrative while she lived a life of luxury on their dime. This betrayal of her own base was the final nail in the coffin for her public image, stripping away any remaining sympathy from the progressive movement. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later, giving the city of Minneapolis time to process the magnitude of the deception that had occurred in its name. In the interim, the special election to fill her vacant seat took place, turning into a referendum on the direction of the Democratic Party. Don Samuels, the moderate who had challenged her previously, ran a campaign focused on healing, transparency, and a return to the basic responsibilities of governance. His opponent, a hand-picked successor from the activist wing of the party, tried to revive the old slogans of resistance and identity, but the voters were exhausted. Samuels won in a landslide, capturing 70% of the vote in a district that was once considered a stronghold for the far left. His victory speech was humble and focused on the future, promising that never again would the district's representation be about the celebrity of the politician rather than the needs of the people. He pledged to open the books of his office to full public scrutiny and to hold regular town halls where real questions would be answered, not deflected. The election of Samuels signaled a broader shift across the country, as other districts began to reject candidates who prioritized social media clout over legislative results. Political analysts dubbed this the Omar correction, a phenomenon where voters aggressively vetted candidates for competence and integrity, skeptical of charismatic newcomers with thin resumes. The Squad, once the most vocal faction in Washington, found themselves marginalized and ignored. Their influence evaporated along with their credibility. On the day of the sentencing, Ilhan Omar stood before the judge, stripped of her title, her power, and her excuses. The judge delivered a blistering rebuke, stating that her actions had done immeasurable harm to the immigration system, the integrity of Congress, and the trust of the American people. He noted that she had been given an opportunity that millions dream of, rising from a refugee camp to the halls of power, only to use that position to commit crimes that were motivated by pure greed. He rejected her request for leniency, citing her lack of remorse and her persistent attempts to frame her prosecution as persecution. The sentence was severe: 10 years in federal prison, restitution of the stolen millions, and the initiation of denaturalization proceedings upon her release. The image of Ilhan Omar being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, not as a martyr, but as a convicted felon, was flashed across screens around the world. In Somalia, the reaction was a mix of relief and sadness, with government officials issuing statements distancing the country from her actions and reaffirming their respect for the rule of law. The fraudulent marriage to her brother was particularly condemned by Somali elders as a violation of cultural and religious taboos, further isolating her from the community she claimed to represent. In Washington, her office was cleared out, her nameplate removed, and her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale taught in ethics classes. The Democratic Party moved quickly to erase her from their history, removing her speeches from their archives and scrubbing her name from donor lists. The denaturalization process, a rare and extreme step, was pursued by the Department of Justice on the grounds that her citizenship was obtained through the underlying fraud of her asylum and marriage applications. Legal experts debated the precedent, but the evidence of the fraudulent marriage to her brother provided a clear legal pathway for revocation. The message was unequivocal. Citizenship is a privilege based on a social contract of honesty, and breaking that contract has the ultimate consequence. The prospect of deportation back to Somalia, a country she had not lived in since childhood and whose government now viewed her with disdain, became a looming reality. It was the final tragic irony that the woman who had spent her career attacking American borders was now subject to their absolute enforcement. Meanwhile, the cultural impact of her downfall rippled through the media landscape, forcing a reckoning within news organizations that had previously protected her. Journalists who had been accused of Islamophobia for asking basic questions about her background were vindicated, while outlets that had dismissed the allegations as conspiracy theories faced a crisis of confidence. Retractions were printed, editors' notes were appended to old articles, and a new standard of scrutiny was applied to politicians of all backgrounds. The identity shield that Trump had dismantled on that stage in Minneapolis was no longer a viable defense in the court of public opinion. Voters now demanded that allegations be addressed with facts rather than accusations of bigotry, fundamentally changing the rules of political engagement. The 9/11 families, who had been so cruelly dismissed by her rhetoric, found a measure of peace in the verdict, feeling that the dignity of their loved ones had finally been defended. They released a collective statement thanking the investigators and the public for refusing to let the issue fade away, reaffirming that memory and truth are powerful forces that cannot be silenced by political fashion. The memorial in New York seemed to stand a little taller, the sacred ground no longer shadowed by the disrespect of a sitting official. The phrase, "some people did something," was reclaimed, not as a minimization, but as a reminder of the vigilance required to protect the nation's history from revisionism. It served as a testament that while politicians may come and go, the truth of what happened that day remains absolute and non-negotiable. As Don Samuels took his seat in Congress, he brought with him a photograph of the Minneapolis skyline, a reminder of the people who just wanted safe streets, good schools, and honest representation. The drama, the tweets, and the international controversies were replaced by the boring, essential work of legislation. The district began to heal. Neighbors who had been divided by the polarizing rhetoric of the previous years started talking again, and the fever broke. The story of Ilhan Omar faded from the daily news cycle, replaced by the issues that actually affected the lives of Americans. But the lesson remained etched in the political consciousness. In America, no matter who you are, no matter your story, and no matter your identity, you are answerable to the law. Years later, political science students would study the rise and fall of Ilhan Omar not as a tragedy of potential, but as a case study in hubris. They would analyze how a politician could have everything: the perfect narrative, a massive platform, and a devoted following, and lose it all by believing they were untouchable. The archives would show the videos of her confident deflections, her aggressive attacks on critics, and finally, her silence in the face of undeniable proof. The story would serve as a permanent warning to future leaders that the American system, while often slow and sometimes flawed, eventually corrects itself. The truth, once exposed, has a momentum that no amount of spin can arrest. The saga ended not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a prison cell door, a sound that echoed the finality of justice served. The identity shield lay shattered on the floor of the convention center, a relic of a time when politics briefly lost its tether to reality. America moved forward, bruised but wiser, having reaffirmed the principle that in this republic, the only title that truly matters is citizen, and with that title comes the obligation of truth. The flag emoji that viewers had dropped in the comments months ago remained as digital artifacts of a citizenry that had demanded better and won. And in Minneapolis, the snow fell on quiet streets, covering the tracks of the past, preparing the ground for a new, cleaner season.